lecture, we're going to continue talking about Augustine, and we're going to look at Augustine the author. Now, this seems like a very broad category, and it is a very broad category because the collected works of Augustine fill up many, many, many volumes. If you have the collected works of Augustine in hardback on your shelf, it takes up a lot of your shelf. So obviously this is a very general introduction here, but I want to highlight a few things and maybe talk about two of his particular works for a few minutes and where they fit into his overall collection of literature. So Augustine, the author. If we're thinking about Augustine's writings, there are different elements that prompt him to write, different things that drive him to write. And one general category that drives him to write is debates. Debates he's having with different groups of people. So in general terms, Augustine writes, for example, against the Manichaeans. Now, you recall from the last lecture that Augustine himself was a Manichaean for 9 years. So he knew their system very well. But their system was based upon fatalism and based upon a dark-light dichotomy, a kind of dualism, a cosmic dualism. Augustine rejected this. And then one of the things that he does in his writings is he goes back and criticizes systematically in many ways the Manichaeans. This is presented in terms of a debate with a Manichaean teacher. But one of the first things he does is he tries to go back and correct those other people who in his mind are still stuck in the error of Manichaeanism. He writes against the Donatists. And we have seen this in a previous lecture. Augustine thinks that the Donatists are at best schismatics or probably more likely heretics. The Donatists in his mind are outside the church. They're outside the proper area, the proper hierarchy. Their bishops are not legitimate bishops. And so he writes very strong language against the Donatists, trying to convince them to come back to what he thinks is the proper church, and trying to convince others not to get fooled by the Donatists, not to accidentally join the Donatist movement. And then he writes against Pelagians, against Pelagius himself, and against the ideas of Pelagius. And this is one of the very important debates for Augustine in the shaping of his theology. So our next lecture is going to focus on Augustine and the Pelagian controversy. What exactly is going on there? But we see that a lot of Augustine's writings have to do with disputes. They're rhetorical, polemical works against people who, in his mind, are teaching incorrect doctrine. So among his major works, we can talk in categories and we can talk in terms of specific works. If you have the collected writings of Augustine, the overwhelming majority of these are commentaries and sermons. And these two are related because often Augustine's working on sermons while he's working on the commentaries and vice versa. So Augustine writes many, many, many commentaries and many, many, many sermons. And these sermons are interesting because, yes, we get insights into his theology, but we also get insights into the day-to-day life of being Augustine. We talked in the last lecture about Augustine not yet being Augustine as we think about him. And imagine if there was, let's say, a musician who was playing in your town and you didn't really know anything about this person. You may not go. But if you knew that one of the all-time great musicians was coming to your town, you would try to go. Well, apparently the people in Hippo did not realize that Augustine was going to be one of the all-time great heroes of Christianity. Because he says things in his sermons. Where is everyone? We're here worshiping, we're here honoring Peter and Paul. Where are they? Where is everyone? Of course, he says, I'm not talking about you because you're here, but where's everyone else? Last week, there were more people here. This week, there's no one. What is it? Vacation time? Is it August? What's going on? Where is everyone? Everyone's at the beach. Why are they at the beach? So you see his frustration, the actual frustration of being a bishop and a pastor, dealing with real people. And his sermons give us that insight. Now, through his sermons and commentary, also we get a lot of his theology. And this is obviously an important part of Augustine's legacy. He also writes more specifically theological works. And for our purposes here, I want to highlight just a few of his primary contributions to Western theology. It is correct to say that Augustine is the single most influential person in the formulation of Western theology. Western Latin theology, Western Roman Catholic theology, and also much of Protestant theology, because Protestantism obviously comes out of Catholicism. And certain branches of Protestantism in particular are very strongly indebted directly to Augustine. So let's look at a few of his contributions. 1. Original sin. If authors earlier than Augustine knew about original sin, they don't talk about it in the way that he does. And one of the theories is that the doctrine of original sin, as Augustine describes it, is the result of a translation problem. And this is one of the theories, because Augustine doesn't read Greek, as far as we can tell. He has a translation of the New Testament. And when Paul's talking about, in Romans, about the two Adams, the first Adam and the second Adam, yes, Romans chapter 5, he says, Adam, and then he says, all have sinned, and the Latin translation says in quo about Adam, which means like, could be in whom, because all sinned in Adam. And so Augustine's reading this Latin translation, and it looks to him like Paul says, everyone has sinned because in Adam everyone sinned. Therefore, everyone is liable to original sin. But the Greek, the expression in Greek, is mistranslated in the Latin. The Greek expression says, all are sinners because all have sinned. Because all have sinned. So it seems that Paul is saying, we're out of relationship with God because we have sinned. But Augustine reads it as, we're out of relationship with God because somehow all of us sinned in Adam. And from this comes his doctrine of original sin. That really, that sin is genetic, in essence. Sin is passed on through humanity genetically. This is certainly a contribution to the idea of the baptism of newborns. Because if children are born sinners, then of course we want to have them baptized. A child who, if baptism is for the forgiveness of sins, as the Creed of Nicaea says, and if children are born sinners, then obviously you want to baptize them as soon as you can, so that they are cleansed from the sin. This is the doctrine of the Catholic Church, and certain branches of Protestantism, although some branches aren't quite sure where they stand on original sin, they still pick up on the idea, even indirectly, from Augustine. Another idea of Augustine is predestination. Or I should say, another idea that people get from Augustine is predestination. The idea that before the foundations of the world, the eternal fate of everyone has been determined. Predestined, predetermined. Now, does Augustine teach this? In some cases, he says things that certainly sound like predestination. There's no question about that. And critics of Augustine say Augustine taught this doctrine because he had been a Manichaean. Manichaeanism teaches fatalism. Your fate is already determined ahead of time. And the critics of Augustine, the critics of his theology, say that idea of fatalism, Augustine imports it into Christianity. And from that, he gets predestination. And this is debated. There's no question, though, that in the time of the Reformation, thinkers like John Calvin look at Augustine and see Augustine's teaching predestination. They see this as the doctrine of the church. They understand that that Augustine thinks Paul teaches this. So Calvin says, Calvin and Luther and people like this say Augustine has this right. Paul said it. Therefore, you have the doctrine of predestination in a lot of Protestant denominations like Presbyterianism, like Lutheranism. So there's a legacy there of Augustine. One of the things later that Calvin hints at, and that later Calvinists teach, that Augustine does not teach, however, is what's called double predestination. Augustine doesn't teach this explicitly. Double predestination is, on the positive side, some people are predestined to be saved. That's what we might call single predestination. Double predestination says, on the other hand, other people are predestined to hell. So everyone is predestined either in a positive way or in a negative way. And that's called double predestination. Double predestination assumes that no one has a chance, that you are already predestined for heaven or hell. Augustine doesn't seem to teach this in the way that later people teach it, thinking that they're teaching Augustine. So this is a much disputed topic in Christianity to this day, predestination. And many people say, oh, this comes from Augustine. Well, some form of it seems to come from Augustine, but not necessarily the 16th century French version of it that we get later on. Augustine also teaches on the Trinity, a theology of the Trinity. And in this course, we'll be reading the Enchiridion, which is kind of Augustine's systematic theology. And in that, we'll see more of his teaching on the Trinity. And I could do an entire lecture on that, but since we're going to be reading some of this in the course, I'll maybe just summarize it here. Augustine's Western formulation of the Trinity is a hierarchical model. There are three persons, they share in one essence. They're all God, but they aren't all necessarily equal. The Father is kind of atop the pyramid, and the Son is in some sense below the Father. The Spirit is the result of the love that the Father has for the Son. So there's some dynamic relationship there, but in Augustine's model, there is, and he might not say, I meant to say there's a hierarchy, but if you read his work on the Trinity, it's clear that he thinks the Father is above the Son and the Spirit in some ways. There is a hierarchical model versus the Eastern model, traditionally, which is a community, where one person of the Godhead is not above the others. In Augustine, there seems to be a slight difference between the different persons of the Trinity. And another one of his ideas that comes in to play in the Crusades, for example, is just war theory. Augustine has to deal with, we saw earlier, Pelagians and Donatists and Manichaeans. And in some of his writings, he takes up the question, is it ever right to use military force against heretics? And there are times when he presents a justification for this. And so in later periods of Christianity, during the Crusades and other cases, if people are looking for justification to use war, and kind of Christian theological justification, they have found this in Augustine. So these are a few of his primary contributions to Western theology, which some people like and other people may not like so much. We mentioned the general category of commentaries and sermons. I now want to talk about two particular works. This first one, The City of God, you'll also be getting segments of this in this course. The City of God, the longest single work that Augustine wrote. And if you own it, if you ever carried it on the airplane, you know what I'm talking about. It's a very thick book. So I'm not having you read the whole book for this class, although certainly feel free to read it if you want. It's a good read, but it's a long book. The City of God is produced in a very particular context. It's written after the sack of Rome in the year 410. In 410, Alaric overruns the city of Rome and sacks the city of Rome. And this is traumatic beyond belief for Christians in the West especially. No one can believe what's happened. Christians had the idea that because the apostolic tombs were there, because the bones of Peter and Paul were there, that Rome could never fall. This idea of patrons, of protectors, is, in early Christianity we see this a lot. The idea that the local saint, the local martyr whose bones are here will protect us. The city of Thessaloniki in Greece had St. Demetrius, and in times of war they would ask for St. Demetrius to appeal to God on their behalf. Well, Christians believed Rome could never fall because Peter and Paul would not let the city fall. But in 410, that's exactly what happens. So we have to imagine that it's not just the people in North Africa are hearing that Rome has fallen. It's that there are refugees from Rome who are coming to North Africa. And people are saying, how can this be? How can this be? And Augustine, he doesn't really seek to offer them the kind of comfort that they might expect. He says, the problem is not that Rome fell. The problem is you. The problem is with you. You, O listener or O reader, you have been thinking that the city of God is something on earth. You've been thinking that Rome is God's city, that somehow the true city of God is a physical city. That's not what it is. The true city of God is the heavenly city. So stop focusing your attention on the physical world. Stop looking at what's around you right now and saying, this is the ultimate city of God. It's not. There's the city below and the city above. And it says focus your attention on the city above, not on the city below. Even in terms of the tombs of the apostles, people are saying, how can this happen? The tombs of the apostles are there. And he says, you don't understand anything. If you think that what God promised to the apostles was a tomb in an earthly city, your sights are too low. What God promised the apostles is what God promises us. That is citizenship in a heavenly city, the true city of God. So take your attention off the cities of this earth and focus on the city above. The final work that I want to talk about for just a few minutes, and these are not in chronological order, is the Confessions. And of all of Augustine's works, speaking personally, this is my favorite. I love the Confessions. And it's widely recognized as one of the most important works of late antique history, period. Not just Christian history. People who study history of psychology look at the way that he has this internal dialogue with himself. The development of a psyche where you're discussing things with yourself, which we don't often see prior to this. Plato, when he sets up a dialogue, he sets it up with someone else. He's talking with someone else to figure out an issue. Augustine's talking to himself to figure out issues. So I love Augustine's Confessions. And right at the beginning, he makes a statement. And he makes several statements in the Confessions at different points that I find just timeless and poetic and beautiful and very profound. And so in his Confessions, he's looking back on his early life. He's telling us about his young, wild, crazy days, and about his rebellion, and about his mother's faithfulness. He's telling us about all these things. And at the beginning, he looks back and he realizes that all along, God was leading him on a path. And so he says, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in you." Such a simple but profound statement. Looking back in my own life, he says, I can see all the restlessness when my friend died, when the Manichaeanism seemed not quite right, when philosophy wasn't working. Why was it? Because my heart was made for God. And I was never going to rest until I found my rest in God. Later in his Confessions, he's reflecting, closer to the end of this period that he's writing about. And he regrets the fact that it took him so long to respond to the ways that God had been reaching out to him. And he says, "Late have I loved you, beauty so old and so new. Late have I loved you. Late in my life did I finally come to love you. And see, you were within, and I was in the external world and sought you there. I sought you out there. You were in here, but I was looking for you out there. I was looking for that ultimate beauty in philosophy or in physical pleasure. And in my unlovely state, I plunged into those lovely things which you made. I tried to find you through the things that you'd made, instead of just finding you. You were with me, and I was not with you. The lovely things kept me far from you, though if they did not have their existence in you, they had no existence at all. You called and cried out loud and shattered my deafness. The things of the world, the pleasures of the world, the things that God allows us to enjoy, he said, I was so disoriented by these things that I kept looking for them. I kept reaching out for them and trying to grab them, thinking that that would bring me ultimate happiness. But finally, you cried out to me, and even though I was deaf, you finally broke through. You were radiant and resplendent. You put to flight my blindness. You were fragrant, and I drew my breath and now pant after you. This is very rich, poetic, sensory language. He doesn't say, I've sat around contemplating you, God, and I find that most satisfactory. No. You were beautiful. You were fragrant, the smell. I drew in my breath. I drew in the smell. And now I pant after you. I tasted you, and I feel but hunger and thirst. So I feel only hunger and thirst for you. You touched me, and I am set on fire to attain the peace which is yours. The senses, touch, taste, smell, hearing, right? I finally heard you. This is how Augustine came to know God. This is how Augustine came to experience God. And one of the perhaps ironic legacies of Augustine is if people read Augustine and read his theology and imagine that by reading his theology and by the intellectual pursuit of his theology, they're going to come to know God. Because Augustine says, I came to know God because I experienced God. Yes, God was bringing things into my life, but I experienced God. So as we're reading Augustine, reading parts of his Confessions, reading parts of the City of God, I invite you to experience God, to think about how Augustine experienced God. He didn't just know about God. He didn't just think about God. He experienced God in a very, in his sense, very tangible way. So there are questions about Augustine as an author, any of these particular works, or about Augustine in general as an author. Yes?
About the original sin.
Yes.
It appears early in his writings, or it's a late thing after his controversy with
Pelagius. Yeah, so the question is, does it appear early in his writings, or does it show up later after his debate with Pelagius? It seems to show up before that. Yeah, it seems it's not the context. It's not the context of the Pelagian controversy in which he talks about it. It's really in his work, his commentary work on Romans. Yeah, but it will come into play, certainly with his conversation, his debate with Pelagius, as we'll see. Original sin will certainly come into play. Yes.
How could a single author affect all these different churches? I see his effect on the Eastern churches, the Orthodox Church, Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, Protestant Church, like you said. So how come a single, although these are different churches, different traditions, how come one single person affect all this?
So the question is, how can one single person like Augustine affect different kinds of churches, the Catholic Church and the Eastern churches, and then later the Protestant Church? Obviously, people felt like he had important things to say. Even if we look at all those traditions, there are things that Augustine says that people in all those traditions would not be comfortable with. But they obviously feel some connection to him, or they feel that his theological explanations are worthy of being repeated, worthy of being studied. His sermons are worthy of reading. So there's some value given to him really consistently throughout the history of the church. And it's not just after the Reformation. He was very highly regarded before the Reformation. But Augustine's a figure who seems to be eternally popular. And every new generation of seminary students at certain kinds of seminaries, they all want to read Augustine. If you have a seminary in the, at least certainly in the Catholic or the Protestant tradition, if you have a seminary without a course on Augustine, you need a course on Augustine because students will ask for it. So they understand the huge influence that he has had. And so obviously people have found some connection with that. I think that part of it is his confessions, because he opens up his heart so much there. And in my own life experience, and I think history bears this out, it's one thing to have a debate with someone who's unknown to you or who is someone you're kind of imagining. But if it's someone you feel you know personally, you may disagree with them, but you respond to those disagreements differently. I think you give them more grace if you feel like you know their heart, and if you feel like their heart is in the right place. And I think in some ways, people may not agree with things Augustine says, but they still think about this, and they think, we'll give him some grace here because his heart is in the right place. And that's just my speculation. But I do think without confessions, our image of Augustine is very different. And certainly his place in the Western canon is very different.